Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, here with Matthew Schmidt and Adam al-Sirgany.
Howdy.
Today we'll be discussing Midwife to the Fairies, a short story that gives Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. I have no idea how to pronounce that.
Sorry.
I did my best. Éilís Ní Dhuibhne's 2003 collection of new and selected stories, its title.
I think, in all fairness, I adore Ulysses, I adore Joyce, and I have never caught up with how to pronounce Irish.
Fair enough. Midwife to the Fairies is casual, chatty, told in first person, and in many ways driven by its narrator's Mary's voice. Mary relays the story of coming home one Friday from the hospital where she works, wetting some tea, looking at, or as we'd say here in the States, watching the Late Late with her partner Joe. The bell rings, Joe answers. It's a man who we learn is named Sean O'Toole, asking Mary to act as a midwife to his wife, Sarah. Sean and Sarah live in Animo, about 10 miles from Bray, where Mary lives, but in a much more rural, remote place. The O'Toole's home is big, and in it, there are half a dozen, maybe more, big grown men and women sitting around the telly, also looking at the Late Late. But in a way that strikes Mary as unusual, a funny setup, so many of them living together and not saying much to her. Mary assists Sean's wife, Sarah, who's far along, as he said, and she gives birth to a little girl, not much more than 5 pounds, who Mary says by rights should be in an incubator. The whole thing, the way things are in this household, bothers Mary, but she's tired and wants to be in her own bed, so she leaves. But this family remains on her mind, and a week later she gets a shock, sees Sarah's picture in the paper, and learns that her baby was found in a shoebox in the dump near the back of the O'Toole house. Joe warns Mary to stay out of the trial, to not get involved, but the baby's death weighs on her. She gets depressed and finally goes to talk with a sergeant, a great relief to her. But walking to her car afterward, a man who resembles Sean pulls a knife on her, threatens her, and she backs off as a witness. I think that's a lot of summary, so I'll leave it there for now. But I should also add that a portion of this story comes in italics, and sort of like montage in film, even as the italic fairy tale thread closely reflects, and perhaps even guides what I'll call the events of the prose story, the fairy tale thread also offers points of contrast as well as comparison.
Oh, sure.
So let's get into it, guys. I find the perspective in this story to be especially subtle and deft. I think it does a lot of the story's heavy lifting. I'm wondering if you two could speak to how Mary's voice helps set scene, characterize her and others, and maybe we could also take a moment here to mention some of the characters that I haven't touched on.
Yeah, I think the perspective is, Mary telling this story as if she's telling it to you, the listener, or it could be, someone else, such as the guard or sergeant at the end. So it's kind of a long-winded way of confessing her role in this particular death of the child, though she has no actual hand. She's actually the one, that helped birth the child, and even told them that the baby needs to go to a hospital to be in an incubator. However, she still feels guilty on some level, and she can't stand the way it feels in her mind. Near the end of the story, she talks about not being able to eat or sleep, which is why she eventually goes to the guards. However, the way she tells us is kind of like the fact that she feels guilty, but she is trying to prove to us that she's not guilty. In a way, she takes on some of the characteristics, I think, of the TV show that she loves. And she likes the Late Late a lot, but she also mentions Dallas and Hill Street Blues.
Yeah.
So she's a big TV watcher, and, in my mind, she kind of comes across as a character in one of those shows that's explaining, well, here's my thought process, and here is why I did what I did, and please don't hate me for this. And so, I find that very interesting, especially in conversation with the italicized parts, as Ingrid has mentioned, which are part of an Irish fairy tale.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell. And, I think we'll probably get into that later. To speak a little bit about some of the other characters, though, Mary really is the main character because it's told from her POV almost to us, or at least to an audience.
Yeah.
Which I think is important. And the other characters, her partner or husband, Joe, really doesn't figure a whole lot in the story, other than, Mary has to cook for him. Mary mentions that they watch the Late Late together, they go shopping and do some cleaning together, upkeep the house on the weekends. And the only other time Joe's really in the story is when O'Toole comes to the house asking Mary to help because Sarah is going to give birth. And Joe does answer the door, first speaks to O'Toole, finally lets him in, and, is worried that Mary shouldn't go by herself to just outside Animo. He doesn't, on some level, trust O'Toole or O'Toole's family or O'Toole's motivations. We're not really given much from him on that. However, I think it's interesting that Joe in some way still feels like he's in charge of Mary by telling her what she should and should not do afterwards. And Mary just completely disregarding whatever Joe says, which is hilarious. O'Toole, again, we don't get a lot of O'Toole either. We get some of his conversation with Mary, and we get some description of what he's kind of like according to Mary, but he really is still kind of off screen, as are pretty much all the people in the house, and there's a lot of people in the house. Mary does try to kind of put together some sort of family out of those people, thinking that one person is the mother and the father, and possibly the rest of the people there are extended family.
Yeah.
But a little, unclear even to us. Sarah really doesn't say much, and is up in an unheated room in the attic while she's, going through labor, and she really does not, show pain so much, nor does she show emotion of really any kind, which I think is interesting. Other than a relief cigarette after the birth has taken place. I'll let Adam take over from there, I think.
Yeah, I think Matthew's covered a lot of the ancillary characters really effectively. one thing that I'd note is that the narrator continually comes back to what she's told Joe, right? There's something really obvious to her about speaking to Joe. In fact, right, like on page 28, I told Joe is its own paragraph. But she also tells us that over and over and over again. Joe does next to nothing except try and start a car and answer a door, but she constantly speaks to him. I was actually telling Ingrid this earlier in the day. I've been reading this book by the jazz pianist Kenny Werner, and he references a rabbinical belief that a text is not real until someone has commented upon it, right? And I think there's something fantastic about that, in that, like, telling Joe the thing that happens is the difference between this being a fairy tale, like existing in the world of the possible, that Simi relates to the world that we live in, and the world that we actually live in, that something has happened. The only other character I think Matthew hasn't mentioned is Mike Byrne, who's, quote, my cousin that has the garage outside Greystones, who sells the car that doesn't work, to the narrator at the time that it's significant. Other than that, and maybe also the Garda, the policeman who fails to take down enough information to make the narrator accountable to her confession of the crime, which is part of why I bring up Werner, which is that, like, while the narrator does admit to midwifing the pregnancy, ultimately her confession has no meaning because she's neither culpable in terms of contempt, of stating that she's done the thing and, like, stating it falsely, nor she's not made to actually confess the participation. And the police can't prove that because the policeman, the Garda, has failed to actually record that in some way as to translate it to other people in a meaningful fashion. So that, right, like, I mean, I think why Werner quotes that thing and why we all think that thing in some way is anything could be possible within the context of our minds. And someone stating the thing matters only because we can prove that they stated the thing, which matters. And ultimately, this narrator is going to deny what she stated because O'Toole, or the person who looks like O'Toole, is going to threaten her own life, and she's actually going to be validated in not admitting the fact that she admitted it, right?
Yeah, I love it that both of you have thought about this story so far as kind of confession-like, in that Mary does actually confess to the sergeant, and then, retracts that statement. But, I think there is this aspect of it that the voice is so chatty and personal, and it feels intimate and like she's letting you in on things, but it also feels like talking to certain relatives, where she's, like, at once, like, rambling and off point and then on point. And I mean, as a story that seems to have retrospective knowledge, it also it takes these veers in the direction of, like, well, why are we hearing this? And that's kind of what I want to talk about in terms of how the perspective is operating, like, just a little bit more, like, where this story begins. For a relatively short story, we spend what on first read and even second read may seem like an inordinate amount of time with the late, with Mary's weekly rituals. So I want to know, why do that, and to what extent is the beginning of this story informed by its ending? Like, what do you see on second read that points you to where we're headed, and to what extent is some of this rambling important to, the story's voice and to drawing us into it?
Yeah, I don't want to overthink this one, but I do believe that some of what we get off the top is that Mary is a blue-collar character, right? The narrator is blue-collar. She's doing this work 9 to 5, except as she notes, when she's asked to work on a different clock or on a different shift, and that it's Friday night, she's got a couple days, it's her only couple days, she deserves time to enjoy herself. And her joys are fairly small, right? She gets something from what she calls the hot bread shop. That's actually the name of the place, right? I think Napoleon's, these little, which she even has to tell you, right? Like whatever it is feels so extravagant to her, she has to tell you that in Napoleon is, quote, you know them cream slices with icing on top. And I think that's remarkable in and of itself. I mean, for many of us it feels small, but for her it feels like the real deal. Or it feels like the thing that's like extravagant and so on and so forth. So it helps us understand what is being imposed upon her to midwife, something she hasn't asked a midwife, because she's neither a doctor nor a midwife. Her mother and grandmother are midwives, right? Rather, she's a nurse in a hospital that contributes to her being viewed as a midwife by Sean O'Toole. The other thing about that introduction is that, like, apart from like sort of establishing class and situation, is that what's on the Late Late, right? Like, it's this obsession with this woman who's getting famous for being a prostitute, right? Like a sex worker. And I mean, obsession might be a sort of like overly emphatic term, but that she's aware that, right, we never really, the narrator constantly questions the possibility of Sean O'Toole being the father, or what the relationship between Sarah and Sean O'Toole is indirectly. And I think that's part of what it is thematically establishing this possibility that within a social context in which it matters to be not a like prostitute, right, not a sex worker, but where also, despite that primary establishment, you could be famous for writing a book about being a prostitute or a sex worker, right? Like that you like that. I'm trying to think of the way to express this in the way that I mean.
Something there. I think like there's certain like social mores that are coming up.
Right. We don't.
And that she's preoccupied with this character on the Late Late, and with the fact that she gets famous, and that doesn't seem to have to do very much with the story that unfolds.
Yeah, I think it's not.
It's about knowing Mary and how she's thinking about things and about the space she's coming from, and becomes relevant in that way.
Yeah, and I think you're on point there, that like Mary's suspicious of the relationship between Sarah and Sean O'Toole, and why these people are so dismissive of a child coming into the world. And something about that has to do with the expectations of what a child coming into the world should be, which for Mary in her cultural context should be man, woman, married, baby.
I think some of what the opening is doing is just saying, like, hey, I'm just a regular person.
Yeah.
Mary, right? Like, I've got a job, I've got a man, I've got a love for TV.
Yeah.
You know, I enjoy stopping off and getting, you know, some really nice things on Friday to eat.
Yeah.
Because it's a celebration, it's the weekend. I have all these responsibilities, I'm just a regular person. In certain ways that show she's different than the O'Toole household, right? Part of, I think there's a couple things happening here. One thing is that she's telling this story and she wants you to believe it, even though it's very strange. and doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. 2, she's asking you, the audience, the reader, whoever's listening to her confession, to understand that she's just, trying to get by, do the right thing, even if the right thing is maybe wrong. And, why else go tell the guards, the sergeant, that, she delivered the baby?
Yeah.
Somehow she thinks something she did is wrong. And, at the same time, she's also trying to do her duty to her lineage, right? Her mother and her grandmother are midwives. She makes a big point of saying they've never lost a child.
Yeah.
And so Mary feels like it's her duty to go out in the middle of the night, be the midwife, not lose the child. Now, one thing that obviously comes to mind is this child does die. However, it doesn't die because Mary lost the child.
Right.
She does somewhat blame herself for not staying or for forcing the child to go to a hospital.
Right, which is a socio-cultural belief that, right, because her family hasn't allowed this thing to happen, the thought that she should say something to them or say something more or be more urgent, because she does communicate to them that the baby is premature and small, but she doesn't get them to do something.
And part of that is because she's scared of them. She doesn't understand them. It's a situation that she kind of tries to say like she's been in similar situations. However, this particular situation is a bit different even than those other situations in that all of these people are there. They're strangely quiet, ignoring her for the most part, except those that help with the baby and the cleanup and getting her tea. But she feels some sort of dread or, unwelcomeness there. Yeah. And so that contributes to her desire to go home. Plus, she just worked a full week. I mean, it's the middle of the night. Yeah. There's plenty of reasons to want to go home.
But it's also weird that, to her point, right, part of the reason you feel justified, and I've told a lot of people, I've talked a lot about this story in the last couple of weeks since you've sent it to us, that, Ingrid, but that this story bothers me on some level, in a good way, right? It bothers me that, no one cares about the baby being born. And I've worked in enough medical settings, directly or indirectly, to feel shit, man, somebody should care about the baby being born. And she's not, her flat way of telling this story almost confounds that fact. How weird it is that there's a whole group of people living in a house where a baby's being born and nobody gives a damn.
Yeah, I think there are important little moments where Mary begins her story ends up touching on where we go. She begins with the late, which on first read, you're she's watching TV, she's telling us about that, she's telling us about this ritual, but then you find out that when she goes to the O'Toole household, that they're also watching the late, and you see what feels different about that to me. Or you see the way that, on the first page she mentions having no belief in premenstrual tension and postnatal depression and what have you. Which feels like something that she's just spouting off, and the way she's spouting off that, she hoovers regularly as someone who's a professional who works in this field and has opinions on it. But on second read, you start to think this is something that's on her mind, and it's an unusual confession in that way, and a usual one. I think it's actually very typical in fiction to begin with. Some sort of ritual, what would happen, only to move towards something a little more specific, a change in that ritual.
Well, I think one of the things maybe that makes the story difficult is that, according to the first page, she probably had at least one child.
Yeah.
But she doesn't talk about the child. Right before what Ingrid said, she says, quote, I suppose she's talking about the hoovering and the washing, and how she likes to relax on Saturdays and watch the Late Late, but they've moved the Late Late to Friday, and she feels a little hurried to get the dinner on, get the tea on, watch the Late Late. And she says, but it's not the same having it on Friday. I feel that bit more relaxed. I suppose it's on account of not being at work, really. Not that I'd want to change that or anything. No way. 16 years of being at home was more than enough for me. That's not to say, of course, that I minded it at the time. I didn't go half-cracked the way some of them do or let on to do. Right? So she is completely obfuscating something.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, okay, what was her role, if not mother?
Yeah.
And what happened to the child?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or mother, and why did the child stop being significant at 16? Did the child go to college? Did the child die? Did the child run away? And we don't get any of those answers.
Or, is she just talking about working at that time? It's so carefully laid that it's not 100% clear what has and hasn't.
Well, I think she's at home, so she's not working. I'd say that's the one possibility that I exclude there.
At home is kind of like a cat.
Oh, yeah. I feel that.
But yeah, no, I mean, what Mary does and doesn't say, I think, is some of what's intriguing. She appears to be sort of telling us everything and maybe too much about her rituals. But there are little mysteries in that way.
It's the oddity about intimacy is that you can be confessing something as traumatic as, like, I midwifed a child that died a few days later. I feel guilty because I didn't communicate the need for hospitalization strongly enough, and someone didn't follow through on that. And yet, I will not tell you about my personal shit.
My question for you is, if she spent 16 years as a kept woman,
mm-hmm.
why work?
Yeah.
Why after 16 years?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't ask that question of the story. That's a good one. Couldn't tell you.
Yeah, I came to a lot of the expectations in this story wrongly because like most stories, I try and read them without looking at the author or examining the author, which is harder with some than others, right? In this case, because it was a fairy tale title, I came to it independently and managed to read the story down. And I was telling Matthew this, like, it was a real struggle for me. I thought it was the comparison I drew was to The Clockwork Orange, where I thought the author was trying to do an obscure voice, and the idea of it being colloquial Irish was beyond me. And as soon as that happened, right, as soon as I realized that, I read it in a different voice, which changed my relationship to the text entirely. I had to go back, restart the story, and read it in this voice that I heard and that I was actually familiar with, but that I hadn't connected to. And I think that those expectations also change, right? What I understand about those 16 years and what they might mean about when there's a child present in the home or when there's not a child present in the home, and what the mother's life might be socially entirely shift as a result.
That makes total sense, and I imagine that must have been a strange first read for you, because there are so many moments where Mary's voice is very much dictated by the space she's in. Speaking of the story's unusual structure and the different kinds of registers and voices we encounter, let's turn a little to the story's two threads. I don't know, it's one of the things I adore about this story, and in terms of how the story's changed for me over time, it wasn't until sending this story to you that I really researched the fairy tale a little bit. I always just kind of let it be the thread that appears. So let's turn to those two threads, the prose and the italic fairy tale. How much of each do we get proportionally, and did either of you look up the tale, and do you think readers need to follow the story?
Well, I looked it up after having read it a couple times, and it's generally very short, actually. At least the ones I found.
Yeah, I'm actually with it.
Yeah, and so it's almost like we get the entire fairy tale in here, except for possibly the most important part. Only the most important part is missing. Otherwise, you get like a little paragraph here and there throughout the story, and then at the end, a whole bunch right before, like, right after we find out that she has been accosted in the parking lot, and she is fearful and thinking about what she should do, talking with Joe, etc. Well, I think there is an interesting thing to title the story Midwife to the Fairies, because it specifically points you to the fairy tale.
Yeah.
However, the story doesn't necessarily hammer on the fact that the O'Tooles are fairies.
Yeah.
In fact, they're really large, according to Mary. They're all like big people. Not necessarily like fat, but like tall, big people. And so that's different. Of course, everything is also modern in the story versus in the fairy tale. In the story, O'Toole comes in a car, picks her up. In the fairy tale, it's a rider on a horse. And so every once in a while, there's a little bit of the fairy tale spliced in, generally about the right time it would come in this story. Sometimes it comes right at the right time, sometimes it comes after, sometimes it comes quite a bit after. And this, it's somewhat confounding to me, in all honesty, in that, on one hand, I think it's pressing the reader to learn the history, the history of fairy tales, and like what fairy tales do and what their purpose was and why this particular fairy tale is important. On the other hand, in some ways, it is comparing the art of storytelling in the past to the art of storytelling in the present, in particular with televised stories, in a way that is very strange. and maybe, not exactly equal in their power, scope, and importance.
Yeah.
Which is very, like, it makes you upset in a certain way, at least me, if you're a particular kind of reader and a particular kind of viewer of televised or any kind of shot video of any kind, right? And so, like, there's also the fact that the child is kind of, as Adam has already said, like, just nothing is really said about the child.
Yeah.
Nothing said about Mary's possible child or why they don't have children. And nothing is overtly said about television or fairy tales either. Yeah. Right? And this is why it's an interesting story. Let's not say it's not interesting, because it really is. It is a frustrating story, though, in certain ways, to certain people.
Yeah.
And that's okay. A lot of good stories are frustrating. That's totally fine. I think one of my favorite things about this intersection of fairy tale and story is that in the fairy tale, what happens is a child is born and the midwife is asked to put some special balm on the child's eyes because this special balm allows the child to see the fairies.
Yeah.
Right? We don't know the provenance of the child, either in this story or the fairy tale. Right. And so there is a question in my mind of whether the child in the fairy tale is a fairy or a human child because of the balm.
But the fairy, regardless, the fairies are invested in the birth of the child.
Yes.
And they want the child to be able to see the fairies, which is not inherently true of the midwife.
Correct.
Yes.
And one of the interesting things with the balm is that the midwife in the fairy tale secretly puts some balm on one of her eyes so that she can see the fairies as well.
Yeah.
She's not exactly sure what that does at the time she puts it on. But later in the fairy tale, she sees the fairies in a public space and addresses them.
Yep. And
the fairies are upset because they allowed this midwife in the fairy tale to see them so that they could ascertain or help, but they don't want to be seen after that fact. So when she sees them in the public place, the fairy actually asks her, "Which eye do you see me with?" And she tells him it's the right eye. And then the fairy takes a stick and pokes her eyeball out onto the ground.
Yeah.
Which is an amazing, turn of events if you don't know the fairy tale.
Yeah.
And so in this story, which is a bit different,
yeah,
the one that's taking place in, the story real time, right? In O'Toole or in O'Toole Lackey, something like that,
yeah,
threatens Mary in a parking lot with a huge knife and points it at her belly, which of course is telling him that, that is where the womb is. And she is told to keep her mouth shut, or else. It doesn't specify or else what, but, it's the last time Mary sees an O'Toole, as far as we know.
Yeah. Well, it's also it's like seppuku or something, right? That the stomach actually, we were talking about this last night, where the stomach has this possibility to infect the rest of the body. And I think that is a remarkable thing about this. I think that listeners should know that Matthew and I both read for the Fairy Tale Review. And so I had this, we think about fairy tales a lot and are exposed not only to classical fairy tales, but interpretations of classical fairy tales on the regular. And the way in which that's set up in this story is that with page breaks and italics, there is this Irish fairy tale that I think I didn't know until this one. I read several versions of it after reading this story. And I mean, they're all fairly short, right? There's some version of fairies come and visit a midwife. They ask for help of the midwife. The midwife, because of a balm or just because of her interaction with the fairies, sees the fairies later on, and one of the fairies jabs her eye out, right? In the real world version of this, the narrator, Mary, is working at a hospital, is just trying to have a Friday night off, gets disrupted by Sean O'Toole. Some maybe not magical, but unusual things happen, right? When she comes to the O'Toole home, there's a gate, first of all. The gate opens, and she doesn't see who opens it. There's a bunch of people sitting around watching the Late Late and the Late movie who don't give a damn about a child being born into the world. They don't seem to be terribly interested in the child. The child dies and is tossed away. And because Mary has said something, they know that it's Mary who said something to the police. Somehow, despite the fact that her confession of like association with the situation hasn't been stated, they've been stalking her, they've got those kind of resources somehow. And they threaten her in the way that Matthew points out by jabbing at the belly, this kind of like maternal space. I think all that's remarkable and interesting as a connection, and is actually elevated as a connection in some ways above the fairy tale, which leaves a lot more room for just like disconcerting horror of the world. Which is true of a lot of fairy tales, right? That like in many fairy tales, they're so simple and so frightening that it's just like, hey, don't forget that terrible crap can happen at any time to you for being a decent human being.
One of the things that that's really fascinating to me is that, you know, the fairies in the fairy tale don't want to be seen.
Yeah.
But they don't tell her they don't want to be seen.
Yeah.
They take her eye. The implication being like, you know, you didn't follow the rules.
Yeah.
You weren't supposed to put the balm on. Though again, in one of the versions I read, that's not stated.
Yeah.
It's just told, she's just told to like put it on the child. Here, like, she's doing what she feels is her civic duty.
Yeah.
And is threatened for her civic duty. Which is interesting because it twists the thing another twist.
Yeah.
You know, because she's trying to do the right thing. And as far as we know, the midwife in the fairy tale was trying to do the right thing. But yet the right thing gets them in trouble. And so one thing that this story does is put it in a social context. And because it's in a social context, it asks more questions.
Yeah. Which ends up relating to, right, Mary both goes to confession about this. And, right, like Ireland is a very Catholic space. Mary goes to confession about it because she feels poorly about it. And she's actually, she doesn't go to a priest that she knows. She's so ashamed and fearful that a priest that she knows might somehow communicate with someone else that she knows, which is horrifying, by the way. That she needs to confess to someone and let it off her chest, which is part of what you feel like as the reader, is like she's confessing to you that she doesn't want, she wants to be alleviated of the sin, but she doesn't want to be held culpable within the context of the community, which is part of what we learn about from the fairy tale, which is the context of the community is the fairies live in the community. Otherwise, why poke your eye out if they're moving elsewhere and they don't give a damn about you, right? And actually, like, to your point about a social context, this book was published before any of this happened, but a couple of years ago in Ireland, there was actually a nunnery that took in women who had gotten knocked up, and something like 300 children's bodies found just like buried.
Oh, right.
Yeah, this horrified me when I was reading about it, but when I was thinking about this story, I kept coming back to that, so I kept reading about it. And this is my Ingrid moment for the day. It's like thinking about this social context in which, right, like pregnancy outside the context of a religious marriage might have this kind of import, and where the children might have this insignificance, if not given that substantiation of the religious context, and what the story ends up commenting on there, even before the sort of like evidence of that kind of belief and that kind of dismissal by, you know, an organized church or an organized system, or because, you know, Dhuibhne like had that real world experience of the ways in which socially children of that kind can be dismissed. And I think that's incredible and horrifying.
Yeah, I think you know, the threads are talking to each other in unusual ways, and I mean, even as Matthew pointed out briefly, looking at where the threads get placed and how they get placed is really fascinating to me. It is a really short tale in most versions that I read as well. But the story is so entrancing that it takes me taking a step back to think like this. It's not that it's in need of editing or anything, but intellectually I get curious about thinking like, well, what if the whole tale came first? Or what if, the threads came in a different kind of order? One thing I really respond to strongly and love as a reader about this tale is that where the fairy tale thread gets placed feels a little odd to me as a reader. Like sometimes it comes a little after the fact, and there's like this asymmetry about that ends up kind of pitching me forward and backward at the same time. I think that's really cool. I want to talk a little bit about how the threads are talking to each other in terms of magic in particular in this story. Did you read the O'Tooles as fairies? Should we? And what other moments in this story feel magical because of the tale or because of Mary's telling?
Yeah, I think to your point that it matters that I experienced the fairy tale. It's a lesser known fairy tale, right? And it's neither something that has a sort of historical context like Boudica, nor is it like a fairly common fairy tale. And in that way, it's short, it's simple, it's striking, it's disturbing, and it catches me off guard. If you presented the information in the fairy tale as you suggested in advance, I couldn't not read Sean O'Toole and the weird people sitting as a fairy, and I would ask a lot of questions about the role of the child. I still have a lot of questions about the role of the child. In rereading this story, I read this story 3 times, and I still have no understanding of whether or not the child is a fairy. And then I read some versions of the fairy tale, which also don't tell me whether the child is a fairy. And whatever it is, the child matters to the fairies, but when the child doesn't survive, the fairies don't want other people bothering them about it. And I think that ends up being significant, but I think what I'd say is Dhuibhne has there's something smart about putting that afterward, because if you were if I'd read this for the first time and been all right, I'll read everyone who turns up other than Mary and Joe as a fairy, I would have read this story significantly different. And the kind of weirdness of the behavior and my anxiety about that behavior, which is part of her character, right, she's watching the Late Late thinking about all the terrible things that happen to people. She offhand mentions someone who gets murdered in another town, which becomes a big part of the early stuff, right? She wants to drive her own car, they're trying to start her car, so it's not to involve in that. All that would be different if you're oh yeah, she's gonna hop on a metaphorical horse with a fairy by hopping in a car with someone who doesn't communicate with her. I'd read it differently. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's something savvy about that choice, even as I question whether or not it's terribly important for me to know that this story is in conversation with it, beyond the title itself, which already would have made me go how does this connect with an Irish fairy tale?
I see you didn't answer the question of whether you think the O'Tooles are fairies or not.
I think they're just terrible people, man. If you want my direct answer.
I like how you relighted that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on record and say no. I don't think of the O'Tooles as fairies. Do they have fairy-like aspects? Yeah, they do. I don't think of them as necessarily magical in their beings. But there are certain things in the story that have no explanation. When Mary describes going to the O'Toole's compound, right? Yeah. Ingrid has already mentioned that there's a gate, and presumably one of the brothers opens the gate. But, they're out in the middle of nowhere. There's no other lights out. And Mary tells us that basically you can't even tell that there's a house there from the road. She says she can't even see any sheep out there. Quote, "The house you could hardly see either, actually. It was kind of buried like at the side of the road in a kind of hollow. You wouldn't know it was there at all until you were on top of it. Trees all around it, too." He pulled up in front of a big 5-bar gate and just gave an almighty honk on the horn, and I got a shock when the gate opened, just like that, the minute he honked. I never saw who did it. But looking back now, I suppose it was one of the brothers. I suppose they were waiting for him. Right, so to be clear, near the end of the story, the baby is supposedly found on a trash heap out back of this house. Okay.
In a shoebox.
Who found this baby?
Yeah.
That was willing to tell on the O'Tooles if they had any, understanding of who the O'Tooles are in general.
Despite the fact that the midwife, just by communicating, if you follow her timeline, she's only there for a maximum of 2 hours to do the delivery. And they threaten her life. Someone's come to this baby, but also is willing to take whatever consequences to report the more significant thing, which is the baby itself, and create the problem that would even allow Mary to have this conversation with the police.
Right. So I guess my point being, either Mary's tale is significantly eliding certain things.
Yeah.
Or there's more to this than we have access to.
It means the metaphorically popped out eye.
Right. And, I do think one of the reasons to put the fairy tale portions in here is to kind of show how stories work. Once a story's out in the world and people have access to it, it doesn't stay there. It moves. It's, if you've read if you've read this fairy tale one time, because there's something so gruesome in it, it's hard to forget. That's one thing about fairy tales that helps you remember them.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question. Going back to Ingrid's original question, then what is the significance of the late late?
I'll tell you what the significance of the
I can't
wait. Basically, my point being, right, the late late is bringing on people who are either popular or are doing something strange. Right? It's our version of the fairy tale. It's like, look, this person is doing this, and this is, what you can learn and how you can be a person like them.
Yeah.
You too can be popular. You too can have a really interesting story that people will remember. And it's saying that's a bullshit fucking idea because, on the TV, these are people you're never going to meet. And are you really going to remember them? Right? Some of them, sure, maybe, but let's think about, 200 or 300 years down the road if we make it that far as a planet. Are you going to remember, some of these popular people that were on talk shows in the 70s and 80s? I doubt you're going to remember all of them, maybe like one or two.
Yeah.
Well, so then those become the stories that make it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's interesting in that, there's a difference between, say, what's his name, Iceberg Slim, right? I don't know, or what's that DC Madam's name? And like the way in which those folks appear as socially unacceptable people, and the way in which we would respond to them socially, right? Like that as presentation, fairy tale can be something that's too extreme for us to worry about. Or it can be like that's something that's so like horrifying that it would never randomly happen to me in the way that like I would never randomly actually win the lotto, which is why I don't play it. Or it can be something that is a forewarning about possibility within the context of the world. Be careful of the suspicious people who knock on your door at night, so on and so forth, which, by the way, Mary is, right? And it's only by the ill luck of not having her car available to her that she would still, by the way, end up in the same spot. The fear she's protecting against doesn't get saved by being in a car or not.
The other thing I think it's saying is that this is the late late is the fairy tale of the masses.
Yeah.
It's the way, people are supposed to act.
Yeah.
And it's telling you, like, if everyone does all these things and follows these rules, like, you're going to be able to sit on your couch and watch other people live their lives. And your life is your working life. This is going to keep you working. We're going to entertain you while telling you how to live. And then you're going to go work for me, and you're going to live nicely so you can stay in line. Like, it's in a certain way. I think that's a generalization.
No, I don't think we disagree in that, like, what we're talking about is that, like, metaphorically, I know, Ingrid, we're going real metaphorical here, right? Is that, like, the individual who writes the book that's being discussed on the late has done something socially unacceptable, and there are risks involved in that. You can judge them by viewing the late qua fairy tale or metaphorical fairy tale, but that what you can't do is step out of line. You can even interact with the fairies within the context of this particular fairy tale, but what would be out of line is to ever address the fairies themselves or tell the wee folk or the magic people anything about your awareness of them. All you can do is be an observer of the late or the fairies, the people who live on this other plane. And as soon as you interact with that, you open yourself up to the risk of either you have to go extreme enough to be someone on the late or you risk the damage that it does to you physically, right? Like poking your eye out, like, get out of here. And I think that's really interesting, actually, about this story.
I think that's one of the tensions at work. I would add that, I think thinking about the language I used in introducing this story in terms of montage, I think there's something about the way that TV comes on. TV, the Late as a program is introduced. The way we have this fairy tale thread and the way we have Mary's story and Mary's differing interaction with the Late over time, that ends up doing this really fascinating thing, I think, in terms of creating the potential for comparison, but only giving us Mary's perspective on things at times, as opposed to the writers. I think thinking about the Late as a kind of modern fairy tale is on the page and doesn't, in that, Mary doesn't directly say, like, oh, this is like fairy tales. But of course the comparison's there. We're thinking about it as readers because, like when we put two shots together, just by being next to each other, we're already thinking about that comparison, right?
Yeah, it's like that eyes and sun thing
I think that starts to be something the story's worrying about, but also, I think it's so apt, and I'm so glad that we're here, that we're thinking about, like, Mary as voyeur, and Mary as someone who's watching other people tell their stories, and then Mary getting involved in those stories, and a very real difference there. and how that's interacting with the tale. So let's stay with that a little, and also go to where the story ends and think about some of the things this story is concerned with and worried about. I think it's actually a very worried story. What does it seem to be saying about its own events, if anything, and about blindness in particular, and maybe seeing in particular, watching?
Can I read the last paragraph?
Yeah, please. I think that might let listeners in.
It's a shockingly it's a paragraph lacking in pathos to an enormous degree. Sometimes I do think of the baby. She was a dawning little thing. There's no two ways about it. She might have had a chance. In intensive care. But who am I to judge? I tried to read that with the troubling calmness. But sometimes I do think about the baby is an incredibly disconnected statement. Individual paragraph. She was a dawning little thing, which, because I know most of our listeners right now are American, dawny being she's a little sickly, right? Comma, there's no two ways about it. Just side commentary. Be assured she was sickly, despite the fact you already know she died. She might have had a chance, comma, in intensive care, if they'd listened to me. But who am I to judge? This paragraph troubles me so much. But it's so much about the need to not state, right? To not overstate. It's the social control / fear of, right? Fairy tales have this incredible potential to offer us spaces to talk about the unspeakable in so many ways, right? If you read Marie Tatar's translations, there's so many German fairy tales of just about wild stuff that we can't discuss.
If anything, fairy tales have been neutered over times, which is something that I find interesting about this. It takes, a tale about punishment and blinding someone, sometimes for disobeying, sometimes not. And makes it more horrific. Yeah,
this is a fairy tale that in this context works like the worst versions of religion, which are if you step out of line despite your own empathetic feelings and good intention, you'll be punished. And that horrifies me. And for that reason.
There's something causal in the tale that isn't in the story.
Yeah, but because the who am I to judge, and she stepped away, and the abdication of responsibility given to her by the priest who's alleviated her of her own fear of needing to have done something else. All of that stuff leaves me honestly mortified. And that's what I have to say about that.
I think Mary believes, I think, Ingrid, you said something earlier, just in this question about how Mary's watching the Late Late and seeing the stories and fairy tales kind of, and then, she gets involved in one. I think it's more complicated than that.
If you see it as a fairy tale.
I think it's more complicated.
More late night story.
Agreed. In that she speaks like she knows the host. She speaks of Gay Byrne as if she knows Gay Byrne because she's watched this for so many years.
Yeah.
She calls him Gaybo, which is one of his nicknames. And so, it does the thing where it's maybe this is a fairy tale in Mary's mind. Or maybe it's just something that happened that she was involved in, and she's, pushing this all out of proportion to show how important it is as a learning device or tool.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating. because the last line, but who am I to judge? She's just judged all the people on the late late.
Indeed.
She's judged herself.
All of it.
She's judged everything. She talks about O'Toole, saying like, he was a nice looking young man. Like she finds him attractive. Like she's judging the entire time, but she doesn't want herself judged by others. She only wants herself judged by herself, which I think is interesting because she's the narrator, right? That's one of the reasons the story is confounding in my mind, is that we only get what she gives us, and part of her banter is to, red herring us all along the way to prove she's just a regular person, which she is, but she's going to great lengths to prove that. Now, maybe she's not a regular person in this other way, though, which is the midwife line that I keep coming back to. Here's my real question about the story. If she doesn't have a child, why care so much about not losing one child? To me, this is like grandmother didn't lose anybody, mom didn't lose anybody before this baby's lost. I'm not going to lose anybody. But like, it seems to me like either there's one of two options. Either that midwife line's going to go on, or it's going to stop. Yeah. So is the death of the child in the story the stopping point, or is there a child that she has that's going to be a midwife?
Well, also, why doesn't I think to your point, it's significant that the child isn't. This confounds the hell out of me. The child that's born isn't stillborn.
No.
The child that's born lives, and I mean, in my own logic, which doesn't necessarily equate to Mary's logic, I struggle to understand why Mary would feel responsible in any way, shape, or form, because she doesn't know even so much as, we don't get that much about what the news has had to say about this child discovered somehow in a trash heap, in a shoebox, on a private piece of property in the middle of nowhere that you wouldn't know was only 10 miles from Animo, right? And I think there's something so wondrous and strange insofar as that, like, she needs to confess having birthed the child, which, like, because I grew up in the middle of, like, nowhere, I happen to know the doctor who birthed me. And I know him personally, and I know his kid. But if I died at 32, he would worry about that, not because he birthed me, right? Because he, like, knew me, not. And I think that's odd, right? Like, that we don't actually get what the cause of the death of the child is, which, if it is so well reported, there's something presumably, right? Like, if there's a baby dead, there's some kind of autopsy or something going on in which you would say the child was premature, in which, okay, Mary's concern is semi-justified, but she doesn't actually say that kind of thing, which leaves a lot of questions about. There's a million ways to kill a baby, and I don't mean that like, like, hey man, but I mean, like, in that her culpability is relevant to how the child actually passes away, and how the child is treated after the death is relevant, but also her culpability ends with how otherwise it's just like any of our deaths, which is like only relevant to the people who care about us insofar as they know us and are connected with us. And, if someone shot me and you saw it, you would tell the police, but otherwise you two are people who know me, not people who saw my death.
Right? I think the other thing Ingrid asked about blindness, and I think one of the things the story is telling us about blindness is that most often the blindness is about ourselves.
Yeah.
Because Mary is blind to herself on certain levels.
Oh, yeah.
On other levels, she's very clear.
Yeah.
But it's like, we each have this idea of who we are. People are like, when you meet someone, they're like, who are you? you have to come up with some story about who you are and what you're doing in this place where you meet this person. And it's really hard.
Yeah. No one has to turn up here.
Yeah.
Now you got to excuse yourself for being here.
And it's a weird situation.
Yeah.
And in this context, right, she's telling us about herself and actions and thoughts and so on, you know, but she can't, like, say to herself, this is why I feel like this.
Yeah.
And it's really, that's like the thing that maybe, you know, you're kind of getting with her idea of the baby. She doesn't want to talk about it because she knows maybe how she feels about it. She won't tell you.
Yeah. But she's telling you a lot of stuff, man.
I know.
Yeah, I think that's so much of what drives this story, how intimate that voice is, but how porous the story is ultimately. Like, I mean, one thing I ended up thinking a lot about after reading some of the tales is, in many of the ones that I encountered, the blinding happens after seeing a fairy committing a crime. And I think it's really interesting that portion of the tale doesn't get interwoven into this tale, because I feel like it's the right move. I think it would push the story too much in the direction of understanding what happened to the child. If the death was just about prematurity and negligence, or if the child was killed in some way. But, you know, I mean, I think one thing I end up thinking about a lot because of the blinding and because of the story, the way the story ends, is the privacy of the O'Tooles and how quiet Sean is, and why Mary might not be welcomed into that space. And I mean, just what I get from Mary on the page. I think the two of you are so right that we understand that she's depressed and that she feels guilty, but she's unable, for whatever reason, to articulate why exactly that is. What we have is that she gets a bad feeling being there. She feels like the child needs more care, and she feels like maybe even Sarah, the mother, needs more care, but she leaves because she's tired and because she feels strange there. And, you know, the guilt could only be that, a feeling of like, I'm a midwife, my mother's been a midwife, my mother before me, or my grandmother is a midwife, I have a certain responsibility as a midwife. I sensed that something was off here, I should have done more. Or it could be much more than that, as you two have pointed out. I think the story pulls us in a lot of different ways because it's porous, and I mean, to me, that's some of what is finally really fascinating about it.
Yeah, I think that both in terms of, like, right, like I think about the number of, like, Ingrid and I lived in Brooklyn for a long time, and I, for whatever reason, like, in Brooklyn saw a large number of fights, and like for some reason I was thinking about a fight the two of us saw while we were going to like find Ingrid a phone case, and this guy came running down the street and got, like, people started shouting about him knocking over an old woman, which justified everyone to beat the hell out of this poor person. I did nothing to stop it other than to puzzle over the situation and wonder out abstractly what I should do with the situation. Right. And like, if I'd seen on the news and it became this like big story that I somehow had to relate to in a social way, like that person had been beaten in a significant way. Like, I don't know what happened to that person. I don't know if that person died or if they just like got up and walked off with a bunch of bruises or whatever. Like, that relationship changes because of the social context of how we relate to the thing, that we're able to walk away from responsibilities because we aren't imposed upon by a social mechanism, a fairy tale, a late, whatever it is. I think the other thing is that, like, in thinking about that in relation to this story, usually when you say the word fairy, I think of a kind of Anglo-Saxon version, like a kind of like a Midsummer Night's Dream version of fairies, like a little impish, but kind of like sexy, like generally friendly, maybe like whatever, right? Like, but like, I don't think of like djinn, I don't think of like little people who have the potential to be evil when you say the word fairy, right? Like, right? Sexy wasn't the adjective. I see the two of you judging me. But like, like that there's something about their potential to be violent. Like, in fact, I think I sent the two of you just the other day this like weird article I was reading about like an English professor claiming to have taken pictures of fairies riding like bugs. Like, but I always think of it being like that, right? When you say fairy, I'm like, look at this wild thing. I don't think of that potential for violence. And so I don't connect it to what's connected to here, which is that the unknowability of fairies and the unknowability of sort of underworlds of violence, or like the semi-criminal world or something, where for some reason it's unacceptable to discuss the basic facts of our lives, to not participate in the world of men and women and people, qua humanity. And I think that's odd and disturbing, and I don't quite know how to grasp it, but like, I think it's part of the mystery that the story raises.
Well, should we end with that puzzlement? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.